Dear viewers, welcome to the Geo interview. I am Deepika Singh and I manage content for the Geostrata. We have with us today one of the finest diplomats and strategic thinkers, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. Ambassador Menon has served as India's National Security Advisor between 2010 and 2014. Ambassador Menon has also served as the Foreign Secretary of India and India's ambassador to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Ashish. I will be taking forward this interview with Ambassador Menon. So we welcome you again, Ambassador Menon. Thank you for gracing our platform with your presence.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So in this session, this will be Ambassador Menon's recollection or a review of their book Choices in light of where India stands today and of course, the wider international environment. So my first question to you, sir, would be, you as India's top diplomat and then as the National Security Advisor had operated within a certain milieu of ideas and principles with respect to India's foreign policy, which of course figures in your book Choices. Now, if I ask you to juxtapose the shape that India's foreign policy has taken today, can you smoothly plug this contemporary Indian foreign policy into your book? Or has it since metamorphosed into something different, something new?
Well, the basic drivers of India's policy don't change. So there are structural and fundamental continuities in Indian policy since independence, for the 75 years or so. So to that extent, there is a tremendous amount of continuity actually in Indian policy. Every government likes to say that its policy is new, that it's different from everybody else, it's better than everybody else who came before it, etc. That's normal, that's part of democratic contestation. But the fact is that the basic drivers, history, geography, economic condition, resource endowment, demography, population, your location, those kinds of things don't change. So there are certain fundamental continuities in policy, and especially in the Indian case, which I think were true when I wrote Choices, when those events happened which are described in Choices, and are true today, and are true actually of the behavior of the government of India. What does change much quicker is the environment, the international situation within which you operate and try and achieve your goals. So, and that, the configuration of forces abroad, for instance, the sharpening of differences between China and the US, for instance, or the economic slowdown and the effects of post-global financial crisis, 2008, which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Those kinds of things change. So there are tactical adjustments that policy has to make to change circumstances. But I think the goals are still the same, the transformation of India, making India a secure, prosperous country in which every Indian citizen can achieve their full potential, or at least has the chance to, the opportunity to achieve their full potential. So for me, the goal doesn't change. Some of the basic drivers don't change, but certainly the environment within which you operate change, and therefore you have to do different things. Today, for instance, in the last year, 4 regimes around us have changed in the subcontinent. Nepal has a new government, Pakistan has a new government, Sri Lanka has a new government, Myanmar has had a military coup, 5 actually, Maldives also, the government has changed. Today there is a developing country debt crisis, and the World Bank, IMF say about 35 countries face real risks of a debt crisis, of being unable, developing countries. And 2 of them are in our immediate neighborhood, are already in talks with the IMF, Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Nepal is at some risk because basically, thanks to the pandemic, tourism earnings are dead. Remittance earnings from the Middle East, etc., have also declined tremendously for these countries. Their workers have been sent home. and commodity exports have been hit. So they're not earning, and these are structural problems. So you have a developing country debt crisis, but you have an immediate problem in your neighborhood. India stepped forward to help where we can, with Sri Lanka, with the Maldives and so on. And so it would make sense if we were to tell our neighbors that you can use rupees to settle your trade accounts with us. And we could then, promote integration and actually see them through this difficult period, because we do have a much bigger economy, much bigger capacity to meet their needs. So there's a situational change to which we react. And each government faces that kind of change. It's not only now that this has happened. Trouble is now, of course, levels of uncertainty in the international system are much higher than they have been for some time, because we are between orders, as it were. We don't have the certainty of a bipolar Cold War world. It's no longer a post-Soviet collapse or post-Cold War unipolar world where the US provides global public goods and dominates the situation. Today, there are multiple regional balances in challenge. The European order is challenged by the Ukraine war, by what Russia wants, what NATO doesn't want to do, what NATO opposes, by the regional balance in Northeast Asia. Southeast Asia is upset with the rise of China. You've seen how South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea. You've seen the balance between India and China is also upset. You've seen trouble on the border the last few years. So there are multiple stresses in the international situation to which the government has to respond. So to the question, is choices still valid? Some of the basic drivers, goals of Indian policy remain the same. The emphasis on the neighborhood. You'll see much of what I've written about in choices is about the neighborhood. It's about China, about Sri Lanka. It's about dealing with our neighbors. I think those kinds of imperatives are the same, but how we respond to individual situations will vary.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was insightful. So the basis, the essence of choices is it's still valid, and we are grateful that we have such a book for posterity to read and understand what were the drivers of these major decisions of Indian foreign policy and how they panned out. So moving on, you had hinted in your book that the dispensation in 2016 was driving India's foreign policy without an overarching conceptual framework. Now, given this, do you sense any incongruity in how India has responded to affairs recently in its neighborhood and beyond, such as the economic crisis in Sri Lanka or the coup in Myanmar, and of course, its position on the war?
I think at core, we have, after maybe some hesitation initially for a few years, basically in dealing with our neighbors at least. Let me put this different. In dealing with smaller neighbors in the subcontinent, I think we are still following very much similar patterns of behavior. The government of India is following similar patterns of behavior. You look at Sri Lanka and the kind of support that's been extended in terms of supplies, in terms of preventing a complete collapse, but not getting involved in their internal politics, not making a choice between, how they settle their internal political differences. After all, the demonstrators are demanding the resignation of the president, and that's their internal affair. But we have no interest in seeing Sri Lanka collapse into anarchy or the people not being able to feed themselves. And so we have therefore stepped up to support at least essential. But we cannot solve Sri Lanka's problems. No outside country can. This Sri Lanka has to sort out for themselves, and their own political processes have to sort those out for themselves. We can only provide help to buy them the time to actually do so. And I hope they manage to do so. But our goal of keeping a peaceful periphery, of a stable Sri Lanka, which stays united, which doesn't attract inimical outside influences or open, because after all, this is right on our periphery. It's separated by a very small body of water. So those interests remain, and the government, I think, has done what it could to pursue those interests and to safeguard those interests during the Sri Lankan crisis. It's the same with the Maldives. I mean, we sent supplies, we've helped the government there, and let's see how it happens. But unfortunately, the difficulty today is, no matter, I mean, how you conceive of the world, of course, makes a big difference. My own sense is that today we are in a world between orders. This is not a world dominated by the United States. She might be the sole superpower. She's the only one who can project military power across the world. But that's not true of the others. There is no other power which can actually match that kind of military power. But the world is multipolar economically. So it's not multipolar militarily or politically, but it is multipolar economically. And politically, we can see it fracturing. We've seen this in Ukraine. We've seen it. We've seen that, and the West might be consolidated, but so is China and Russia as an alternative. And most countries don't want to have to choose sides in this kind of polarization of the world system. So we are between orders. And the international system is not responding either to the debt crisis or to the pandemic. You've seen how feeble the response was to that. So that's really the problem. So countries like India have to do much more in their own immediate neighborhood. Regional powers have to step forward and help.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, you made a very valid, interesting point that the world is multipolar in economic terms, but not so much recently in political terms. And in terms of India's position in Ukraine, I think that would be an interesting thought to elicit from you. So I would like to ask, again, harking back to the conceptual framework that we require. So in terms of that framework, do you think we in India, do we now have an implicit agreement as to what that conceptual framework should be when dealing with such crisis involving such great powers, so to speak?
I'm not sure that we have agreement, and I'm not sure that 100% agreement between everyone is necessary either. I think it's good to have a discussion. These are issues that are never, black or white, right or wrong, true or false. These are issues that need to be discussed, re-examined all the time, because they change over time, over space. I think the official line today in India is that the world is multipolar. And many countries like to say this. I mean, China likes to say it. I think they feel comfortable because they think they are poles, and it's flattering to themselves to think of themselves as a pole in a multipolar international system. But if you look at the actual distribution of power, there is a disconnect between the distribution of military power, the distribution of economic power, and basically political or soft power for that matter. So, which is why I say this is a world between orders. I also say it's a world between orders because you look at the pathetic nature of the multilateral system and the international system's response to the pandemic. I mean, there were lots of meetings, G20, WHO, you name it, everybody met, G7. But what did they do? Ultimately, it was each country for itself. And frankly, even today, there's huge inequalities in the way that vaccines have been distributed in terms of access to medical care. And we're still arguing about IPRs for vaccines. I mean, the last time there was a concerted international response to a transnational crisis or challenge was really in 2009 after the global financial crisis, when the G20 met in April 2009 in London and agreed on a set of measures which prevented another Great Depression, which also helped to stabilize the international banking system and really prevented some much worse things happening after the crash of 2008. So, but since then, the system hasn't worked the way it is. This is why I say there isn't a working international order today, which needs. So what are we left with? Not everybody in India agrees with this description of the world. I mean, there are many people who agree that, yes, the world is between orders. But I think the official line today is that the world is multipolar. India is one of the poles, and we are going to assert our voice, etc. We always had a voice. We're very big. We have influence, and we've managed to change the international system where necessary, whether it was on the nuclear issue at the NSG, or whether it was in changing the geopolitics of South Asia in 1971. You know, India is India. I mean, that I don't think, but I think there's a natural tendency, I think, for each government to say that it is doing much better than anyone else. So we will see that kind of thing all the time. But I don't think there is 100% conceptual clarity or agreement, and I'm glad there isn't, because it means that we're still thinking about the issues, that we're still looking at them, we're still examining the evidence, and that we are responsive to a changing situation around us, which I think is good.
Perfect. And now I would like to quote you directly from your chapter, A Final Word from Choices. So I'm quoting, if individuals attempt to go against the grain of policy as implemented so far, objective reality and India's condition are likely to bring them up short painfully. Again, if we juxtapose India's current decisions, it's for the activities in the MEA, how far has this statement sort of, gone through, or have things not taken the turn as a sort of, as sort of predicted by the statement, as this could happen if things could go in this way? So could you draw some comparisons and then reflect on this quote?
I think our biggest strength for the last 70 years has been that we have been quick learners, that we have learned. Yes, we make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. This government has made mistakes. Previous governments have made mistakes. Everyone has made mistakes. Question is, do you learn from your mistakes and do you get better? And can you fix them? Can you fix the consequences? And how serious are they? I mean, if you look at relations with Nepal, for instance, I think a few years ago, relations with Nepal were really in bad shape. And the Nepalese blamed us for a blockade, for trying to interfere in their constitution making in 2015, 2016, 2017. Public opinion in Nepal was very, very negative on India. And in India, there was an exasperation with Nepal, which was seen as being very close to China, where China was playing a big role in their domestic politics, keeping the communist parties together, etc. So, yet I think we've moved past that. We've learned from that. And if you look at India-Nepal relations today, they're in much better shape. So for me, that is the important thing. It's not that we will never make mistakes or we will always be perfect, or that our appreciation of the situation will always be 100% accurate, and therefore all the things we do will result in exactly what we want. No, but the ability to learn and adjust. And if you look at it over time, from independence, the parts of the government of India which deal with the rest of the world are actually the parts that have changed the most. When we realized that intelligence was insufficient after 62, 65, we split external intelligence, created RNAW. When we realized that we needed to start working across silos, especially after we became a nuclear weapons state in 98, Kargil established the National Security Council. The Indian Army went through fundamental reforms after 1962, and it was a very different army by the time of 1971. Even now, we are undergoing a fundamental transformation in the way we look at and structure and organize the armed forces and the defense of India. So the external facing parts have learned from experience and have been changed and have adapted. They have no choice because we're dealing with things outside our control, outside our sovereignty, much more so than, say, the internal security apparatus of the government of India. If you look at policing, you look at internal security, the Home Ministry, how these things work, these are still very much, look at the laws that are still being used, sedition, these are all colonial era laws. You know, there are things which left over from the past. Those have changed much less. We have added layers and more forces, more this, more that. But frankly, in terms of fundamental structural change or adaptation and improvement, I don't think we have done the same. So for me, that's the important thing, that we learn, that we show capacity to adapt, to learn, and to keep learning. And as long as we can do that in our external relations, you look at our response to the Ukraine crisis. And this stance, which makes absolute sense from an Indian point of view, that look, neither an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, nor calling Russia names and imposing sanctions is going to bring peace or settle the issues here. Because there are fundamental issues of the European security order here. And they both have legitimate interests, both the West, NATO, US, NATO, and Russia, and the Ukrainians, of course. And they need to sit at a table and sort these out among themselves. That's exactly what India has been saying from day one. We have not chosen sides. Now, the West might say, oh, how can you do this? You're condoning aggression. But we want an order which works. We want peace. We don't want oil, energy prices going through the roof, fertilizer prices going through the roof. These are not things that help us. Food prices, you've seen the food prices. So frankly, that kind of stand is exactly what India has done in the past. Previous governments of India have done in similar circumstances. So you can call it what you like, call it strategic autonomy, call it non-alignment, call it, you can change names. Janata Party used to call it genuine non-alignment, whatever you want. But fact is that the impetus to do so comes from the fundamental drivers which I mentioned earlier. And those will drive every government. It's when a government deviates from that in the search for glory or status or for domestic political advantage, that normally you have some trouble. And that is where we need to be careful, I think. But at its core, if you look at it, India still behaves like India and will continue to do so for the reasons that I mentioned.
Ambassador Menon, thank you so much indeed. We would like to conclude this interview on this note, that India will behave like India, and to draw the contours of how that behavior should look like is upon us, Indian citizenry, and we will keep at it. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ashish. Thank you very much. Enjoyed that.
Yes, and we will let Stuti to close this session.
Thank Ambassador Menon for sharing their views with us and guiding a young foreign policy audience. We thank our dear viewers for tuning in. Please share your views with us on social media and email to keep advancing the discourse. Have a great evening. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Stuti. Thank you all.
Thank you.